So in this video today, guys, I want to talk about a very, very important concept that is often not really talked about that much within psychology, and it is the concept of projective identification. Now, this is a term that was later developed, a concept later developed by a woman called Melanie Klein, who was a psychoanalyst. I think someone who was deviation from Sigmund Freud, all of that. And it's a little bit different from projection. Now, projective identification is when you identify with a projection that someone has put onto you. And I think the best way I can probably describe this so that you can understand it is probably to give a personal anecdote from when I was a lot younger and how this affected me personally. Because projective identification happens every day, it happens all the time. And it's actually the crux or the foundation to a lot of the reasons to why people procrastinate, or whatever you want to call it, stop doing what they desire to do for their future self. What keeps people stuck in the past, what limits people fundamentally from their mission in life, or what they want to fundamentally do. So to give you an example, when I was a lot younger, when I was about 13, 14, probably around 10, 12, when I went to school, I was diagnosed as someone with dyslexia. And as probably many of you know, especially in America and Europe, this is a very difficult diagnosis to deal with when you're a child, because it comes with a lot of baggage of assumption, you could say, which is inherent in the projection of this diagnosis. So, when I was a lot younger, I'd carry around this idea that I wasn't very good at anything intellectually through education. I was very bad at maths, and I still am not great at maths, but I would also, not do very well with English or anything like this. I was a bit of a late bloomer, you could say, when it comes to doing things well in the education system. And because of that, I kind of disregarded the education system because of this projection and the lack of support that I would get because of this assumption, this projection of, oh, this kid's dyslexic, he's not very good at this, so we don't really need to, really care about his development on an educational level. So when this happened, I would, very much identify with this. And by identifying with this, you would then live up to this assumption of, well, this kid's stupid. I'd go into class, English literature, English language, math, science, all this, and I would kind of play up to this whole thing of like, oh, I'm stupid, can the teacher help me, play up to this whole projection. Because in a sense, when you're such a young kid and you're in this world of being surrounded by authority figures who are going to identify you as such, you play up to how they identify you because they're authority figures. And being a kid, you're still in that place of trying to figure out who you are and where you stand in the world. And it's very difficult to even find that when you're in school, because it's basically its own little prison world that the educational school system is. So I'd play up to this all the time. And then because I cannot fulfill the desires of what the school wants from me, in the sense of success, educational success, I'd then be very kind of, anarchistic, or what would be the word? I'd be like a little anarchist. I'd go against the school rules, I'd get into a lot of trouble and stuff like this. And, this would, of course, not be because I would want to do that. And a lot of the time, youth, when the youth get into trouble with, their parents or the school, or with authority in general, it's usually out of like a call for like help in some sort of way, right? And it's usually because, well, if I'm not going to be accepted for who I am in this sense, then I'm just going to play up against the system. And that is usually where that kind of behavior comes from. And it was definitely a way in which I would behave, because I'd be like, well, why can't they just see the talent I have in a certain other way? And therefore I'd play up against the school system, or I'd play up against authority, and I'd kind of continue that way of behavior. And the difficult thing is that when you identify with a projection so much that's difficult to break out of, that can seep into your entire life. And if you can't find a way of breaking out, let's say, of that particular projection, that can continue on into your adulthood and get you into all sorts of problems, with crime and things like that. So this is the problem of projection, and this is an example of a projective identification from my own kind of situation when I was a lot younger. And you hold this kind of burden of identity, right? So you got to think like, okay, how do you break the projection to get out of it? Because this is what you need to do. You need to find a way of breaking projection. And there's only a few ways you can really break projection: situational exposure and the act of psychoanalysis itself, analysing your psyche and analysing your own psychology to understand where these things are fundamentally coming from. And for me, I was like, okay, what am I going to do to kind of actually break this projection, to figure out what my actual potential is? And when I left school, I didn't have very good grades or anything, so I was just like, okay, I'm going to self-teach myself A-levels, advanced level examinations, and I would self-teach them myself. So I spent 2 years teaching myself A-levels, without a teacher, without any help, without going to college, without any of that. And I did that, and then I passed it with flying colours. And I spent 2 years diligently kind of disciplining myself to try and really do well with it. And that would break the projection. And then I gained the confidence to be like, oh look, I can actually do these things. I can actually do really well in education if I really put my mind to it. And I don't need the projection of other people in authority positions to tell me what I can or cannot do, or what I am not or am capable of doing. So that is an example of breaking out of that problem. Is, okay, if you want to break a projection, if you want to break something that is within your mind, you have to expose yourself to a situation. You have to put yourself in an environment. You have to put yourself in a circumstance or an activity. You need to routinize it and make it something that's consistent, and you will break out of that projection. That's one example of doing it. But usually, for example, let's say if I'm working with someone on my program and they're dealing with procrastination, you peel back the layers of psychology to understand where it's rooted. And most of the time, it's always rooted in some form of projective identification. Which is why, I'm giving my own personal anecdote of it, but everyone deals with this in different ways. And it's kind of crazy how common it is without people really knowing of the term or knowing of the idea. Because as soon as you describe the idea and you explain the concept, it usually is the first point of awareness that occurs for the individual to then do what they need to do and act accordingly to then break out of the situation that they're in that they don't want to be in. So usually, if you think of the idea of identity shifting, breaking out of procrastination, breaking free from these things, which is what I mostly focus on with people, that usually follows this kind of structure. One is awareness. If you don't have awareness, then awareness of your situation, which is what psychoanalysis can really help with on a psychological level, then it's very difficult to understand the situation in a detailed, personal, subjective way for you to objectively escape and move beyond and overcome the problem. So this is where, some of the techniques I use become really helpful to identify the projection that you are identifying with and understand the root cause of it. So for example, I could be talking to someone, working with someone, and they'd be saying, I identify with these self-limiting beliefs. I believe them to be part of my identity. It's very difficult for me to not break out of them. They're kind of intrusive thoughts about myself, kind of like my subconscious mind telling me something every now and again. Anytime I do a certain behavior or do something in my routine, something is telling me in the back of my head that I'm this, that I'm that I'm not worthy of these things. And that is, you peel back the layers to it, and you find out, okay, this individual who was in authority before in your life used to say things very similar to you in this manner. And it's kind of acted as a superego injunction that the authority of the superego from your past experience and your memories is pervading and invading upon your ego and invading upon how you identify yourself. And understanding this, identifying it, seeing where these things are coming from, being aware and having awareness to this is the first step to curing the problem, most often. Because then the second step would be to craft an ideal identity, a future image of yourself, and then to act accordingly in relation to that, whereby these beliefs, these self-limiting thoughts, don't become and are not consistently something that are stopping you because you would have identified where they originate from. And that is really a first step to breaking out of that. And there's so many different techniques you can use for that. Self-esteem building, using Socratic philosophy to break down, understand cognitive distortions, understanding self-limiting belief systems, how they occur, what they look like, enacting upon different therapeutic methods like cognitive processing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, all that type of stuff. And I try to implement that as much as possible with people I work with. And it's usually always the case that projective identification is the first thing, understanding what it is, seeing where it comes from, and working for it is usually always the way forward with this type of stuff. Now, if you believe at all that this is something that is relevant to you, you believe that you are suffering with some form of projective identification, that things like a past memory is keeping you down and keeping you stuck. Usually this is the case in a procrastinatory lifestyle where you're procrastinating on what you want to truly do and you can't figure out a way to break out of this so that you can move forward with your life. In any kind of sense, in relation to bad habits, anything like that, self-identity, doubt, anxiety, anything like that, then you can book in a free one-on-one call with me and we can talk with each other to see if there is possibly a way that we can work with each other in the future to break you out of this problem, because usually projective identification is at the foundation of a lot of these cases, especially of the people that I've worked with through this program. So if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description, antiprocrastination.card.co, and I will look forward to talking to you, and I'll speak to you in the next video. Thanks for watching.